freuen uns, dass ihr heute hier bei uns seid. Es ist nicht nur der Fenstertag, sondern auch strahlend schönes Wetter draußen. Und gestern hat die britische Innenministerin Priti Patel den Auslieferungsantrag für Julian Assange an die USA unterschrieben. Und wir freuen uns, dass wir euch heute den Film Hacking Justice zeigen können. Der ist ursprünglich aus dem Jahr 2017 und dann aktualisiert worden 2021. Die Marie-Odile Dora wird ein paar einleitende Worte zum Film sagen und ich möchte euch noch gerne vorab den Ablauf vorstellen. Wir haben im Anschluss an den Film, wird Odile auch noch einen Überblick geben, was dann seit dieser Aktualisierung 2021 weiter passiert ist, und wir werden dann ein Filmgespräch haben mit Stella Assange, der Ehefrau von Julian und Mutter ihrer beiden Söhne. Und auch Richard Medhurst hat heute noch super kurzfristig zugesagt, auch als Impulsgeber da zu sein. Richard Medhurst ist Journalist und ein politischer Kommentator, der sehr, sehr kritisch Bericht erstattet, sehr lange auch schon über den Assange-Fall. Und ja, da freuen wir uns dann auf die beiden im Filmgespräch, wo ihr dann auch natürlich Gelegenheit habt für Fragen, Kommentare, eure Beiträge. Und ich möchte das Wort nun übergeben an Marie-Odile Dora und bitte dich um die Einleitung zum Film Hacking Justice.
Danke, Barbara. Guten Nachmittag, nicht Abend. Okay, der Film war zuerst gedacht als Dokumentarfilm über den Richter, den spanischen Richter Baltasar Garzón. Der war derjenige, der zum Beispiel unter anderem den Pinochet aus Chile, den Diktator, vor Gericht stellen wollte und für seine Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit. Während den Dreharbeiten kontaktierte Julian Assange Baltasar Garzón und fragte, ob er sich seinen Fall annehmen würde. Und er hat zugesagt. Und die 2-3 Wochen Dreharbeiten, die es gewesen wären, wenn es nur eine Doku über Garzón geworden wäre, haben sich über 9 Jahre erstreckt. Renata Avila, eine Anwältin von WikiLeaks, wird im Film auch erklären, warum der Film Hacking Justice heißt. Und ich sage nichts mehr dazu, weil diese Doku ist auch einzigartig insofern, dass es die einzige ist, die die Geschehnisse dieser Dekade von der Sicht von Julian Assange und WikiLeaks erzählt. Die hat keine Abwertungen, sie ist nur faktisch und frei von jeglichen Abwertungen. So, da wäre mein Teil fertig und ich wünsche Ihnen einen guten Nachmittag mit den Informationen, die Sie jetzt in Hacking Justice sehen werden.
Ich möchte die Gelegenheit noch nutzen, zu danken für die freundliche Unterstützung des österreichischen JournalistInnenclubs und dem Wiener Burgkino und möchte den Steffen bitten, den Film einzustarten. Danke.
Die Amerikaner haben natürlich Berufung eingelegt und sie hatten 5 Punkte. Sie haben der Richterin angeklagt, dass sie ihnen nicht gesagt hat, wie sie sich entscheiden würde, und deswegen hat sie ein falsches Urteil gemacht. Und wo bitte sagt eine Richterin einer Partei, wie sie sich entscheiden wird und der anderen nicht? Okay. Und die hatten 5 Punkte und wollten auch den Gesundheitszustand, also die psychiatrische Gutachten und so, diskreditieren. Von diesen 5 Punkten hat ein Richter 3 zugelassen. Sie haben wieder berufen und 2 andere Richter des High Courts haben dann alle 5 Punkte zugelassen und haben dann das weitere Verfahren auf Oktober festgelegt. Das war im Juli. In der Zwischenzeit im Sommer sind 3 Sachen passiert, die hätten einen Einfluss auf den nächsten Urteil haben sollen. Im Juni.
Das war letztes Jahr.
Ja, also alles, was ich jetzt sage, ist letztes Jahr. Im Juni gab es einen Artikel in der isländischen Zeitung Stundin, wonach der Hauptzeuge der USA eigentlich das FBI angelogen hatte. Er war ein Mitarbeiter von WikiLeaks und hatte behauptet, Julian Assange hätte ihn ermuntert zu hacken und selber gehackt. Also das war einer der Hauptzeugen. Der war selbst ein verurteilter Betrüger und Pädophile. Das war der Zeuge der USA. Außerdem hatte er für WikiLeaks gearbeitet eine Zeit lang und hatte dort $50.000 gestohlen. Danach kam ein Artikel in Yahoo, wonach in der Administration Trump, also unter Trump, das CIA Pläne geschmiedet hatte, Julian Assange aus der Botschaft zu entführen und sogar zu töten. Die Pläne haben auch inkludiert eine Schießerei auf die Straßen von London, wenn es sein muss. Und dieser Artikel wurde laut Artikel mit 30 verschiedenen Quellen aus Geheimdiensten und verschiedene hochrangige Beamten der Administration Trump, also bestätigt. Und dann gab es noch ein Auslieferungsverfahren, das Richard Medhurst aufgedeckt hat aus Spanien. Da wollten die USA einen Spanier ausgeliefert haben und sie hatten Zusicherungen gegeben an die Spanier. Und als er dann ausgeliefert wurde und verurteilt wurde, die Zusagen waren, dass er in Spanien seine Zeit absitzen durfte. Ja? Und mit diesem Herrn gab es einen Vertrag. Es gab nicht nur Zusicherungen, sondern auch einen Vertrag. Und die Amerikaner haben das alles ignoriert und er musste öfters klagen, bis er nach 7 Jahren zurück nach Spanien gekommen ist. Kommt dazu, dass alle Menschenrechtsorganisationen, Amnesty, Reporters ohne Grenzen und so weiter, eigentlich die Zusicherungen der USA für unglaubwürdig gefunden haben. Also dann kam der Oktober und da gab es diese Verhandlung und in der Verhandlung war Julian Assange über Video vom Gefängnis zu sehen. Es ging ihm schlecht und wir haben später erfahren, dass er eigentlich einen kleinen Schlaganfall hatte. Und dann haben die Richter am 10. Dezember von allen Tagen, am Tag der Menschenrechte, also den haben sie sich ausgesucht zu verkünden, dass Julian Assange ausgeliefert werden könnte. Und Julian Assange und sein Team, seine Anwälte wollten dann zum obersten Gericht und das wurde vom obersten Gericht, haben sie gesagt, na, da gibt es nichts, was wir da ändern könnten. Keinen Punkt in den Gesetzen, den wir ändern könnten. Also ist alles klar. Und somit ging alles zur ersten Instanz, damit sie die Papiere vorbereiten für die Innenministerin. Und wir haben eben, wie Barbara vorhin erwähnt hat, die Innenministerin Priti Patel hat gestern die Papiere unterschrieben. Das ist der Status jetzt, aber bevor meine Geschichte, also das, was ich zu erzählen hatte, ist fertig, aber ich möchte einen kleinen Paragraphen von einer Aussage von Nils Melzer machen, aber ich habe mein Papier vergessen. Entschuldigung. Nils Melzer hat gesagt, wir müssen aufhören zu glauben, dass es bei Julian Assange wirklich um eine Strafuntersuchung wegen Sexualdelikten, Spionage oder Hacking geht. Was WikiLeaks getan hat, bedroht die politischen und wirtschaftlichen Eliten weltweit gleichermaßen. Der Fall Assange zeigt, dass es den Regierungen heute nicht mehr um legitime Vertraulichkeit geht, sondern um die Unterdrückung der Wahrheit zum Schutz von unkontrollierter Macht, Korruption und Straflosigkeit. An Julian Assange soll ein Exempel statuiert werden zur Abschreckung aller, die die schmutzigen Geheimnisse der Mächtigen ans Licht bringen wollen. Das wär's. Und ich glaube, Nils Melzer hat es richtig zusammengefasst und deswegen stehen wir bei der Mahnwache jeden Mittwoch in Wien bei der Oper. Dankeschön.
Dankeschön, Marie-Odile Doran. Ich wollte dich noch bitten, nur zur Sicherheit, könntest du noch mal kurz sagen, wer Nils Melzer ist? Und dass wir draußen einen Büchertisch haben, bitte.
Okay, Sie haben hier einen Amateur vor sich, ja? Also Nils Melzer den haben Sie eigentlich im Film gesehen. Er ist der UNO-Sonderberichterstatter für Folter, war er bis vor kurzem. Und er hat den Fall Julian Assange untersucht, gründlichst, und hat sich sehr eingesetzt für ihn. Er hat das Buch geschrieben, der Fall Julian Assange, die Verfolgung, die Geschichte einer Verfolgung, danke Philipp. Und wir haben es draußen auf den Tisch in Deutsch und in englischer Fassung. Wobei die deutsche Fassung bis Februar ist und die englische bis zu Oktober 2021 geht, weil sie sind nacheinander erschienen. Habe ich noch was vergessen, Barbara? Okay, gut, das wär's.
Vielen Dank, ich habe jetzt ein eigenes Mikro. Und Barbara, Barbara Meister, wenn du mich in der Vorführkammer hören kannst, ich brauche bitte noch die neue Meeting-ID. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass wir heute Richard Medhurst auch hier begrüßen dürfen. Bitte schön, Richard, das ist dein Mikro. Richard Medhurst ist Journalist und politischer Kommentator und betreibt einen sehr, sehr erfolgreichen YouTube-Kanal. Nicht nur YouTube, man muss ja mittlerweile ausweichen auf die verschiedensten anderen Kanäle auch. Aus Sicherheitsgründen würde ich jetzt mal so sagen.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and to Candles for Assange and the Austrian Journalists Club for hosting all of this. I just wanted to say that to answer your question, well, this is really a political witch hunt. I think it's one of the most open, brazen attacks that you have on not just press freedoms, but a journalist. Assange is one of the most consequential journalists of our time. You know, most of the people that speak about Assange in the media have not even done 1% of the work that he has done. And I think that's a lot of the source of the jealousy that also comes about Assange, that they don't really fight for Assange. That's why you haven't seen a big effort from the mainstream media to actually fight this case. They have not done their job as the fourth pillar of democracy, as they like to pretend to be. So this is one of the reasons that we've had the decision yesterday with Priti Patel. I am a British citizen, so she is my Home Secretary, and what she has done is a disgrace, and it's shameful and disgusting, and it's a stain on Britain's history, and which is already not a really good one. And then on top of everything that we hear about, the UK being a democracy and fighting for press freedoms, this is really a slap in the face of anyone who claims to stand for that, for those values.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your first impression. I see Stella Morris is online now, and we try now to get her picture on the big screen.
Well, we have 14 days to lodge our grounds for appeal. And that is just, it's not the exhaustive arguments. It is presenting to the High Court the grounds on which we wish to appeal. And that is all the points that Julian originally did not win back in January 2021. And just to remind you, this involves the press freedom arguments, the arguments that Julian is being requested for extradition for a political offense under the US Espionage Act, which is prohibited by the bilateral treaty between the US and the UK in Article 4. It is also argued that the prosecution itself is politically motivated, and that there is a abusive process in the US's pursuit of Julian, not just through the indictment, what happened since the indictment, but before. And all of these points are very strong on their own, and should have barred the extradition to begin with. But now the High Court will be able to look at our arguments and the evidence, and added to those original points are the points that we will challenge in relation to the Home Secretary. So effectively what happens now is that Julian appeals not just against the US government, but also against the UK Home Secretary, who took the wrong decision. And then we have some important new elements that have come in since the decision was taken back in January 2021. So just to remind you how we got here, Julian originally won at the lowest court, the district court level. And then the US appealed, and they appealed basically by moving the goalposts, making political assurances, which the High Court deferred to. The High Court accepted all the evidence. They accepted the doctor's evidence that Julian was at high risk of suicide, if extradited to the United States, placed in isolation, and so on. But they also said, well, the US has now made undertakings to the UK government, and we'll accept those. And the decision is shocking, really, because when you look at the letter that the US government sent to the UK government, the letter is appalling. It isn't a letter that prohibits that puts any imposition on the US government. On the contrary, it is a letter by the US government saying, we reserve the right to put Julian under the conditions that will kill him. That is literally the meaning. You read it, that's the literal meaning of what those assurances say. And the US government deliberately did not put out that letter, did not put out the wording of the letter. And what you saw was a lot of reporting immediately when the fact of US assurances was aired in the US media, selected outlets. And the narrative around these assurances are that they prohibit the treatment. But in fact, when you look at the letter, they allow the treatment. So it is completely, it is like completely Orwellian. And so on the basis of those shocking so-called assurances, the High Court reversed the decision. It's completely incomprehensible from any, objective standpoint that they could have reversed the decision on that basis, given that they accepted all the medical evidence, the fact that isolation, solitary confinement, etc., would kill Julian. They still allowed it. So I see this just as the higher courts going along with the political case. But anyway, the Amnesty International called those assurances travesty. Sorry, the decision by the High Court, they called it a travesty. And so that's what this extradition order, which the Home Secretary has now agreed to, rests on, a travesty. But as I was saying, there are some important new elements that have come in since that original decision in January 2021. So just to simplify where we're at, the appeals that have happened until now basically set us back to where we would have been if Julian had lost the district court hearing. So we're basically set back to where we were in January 2021, having lost all the points. And that means we can appeal all those lost points. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to at least attempt to appeal all those lost points. The High Court can decide, can pick and choose which arguments it wants to hear. But there are some new elements, new evidence that have introduced an enormous weight behind some of those arguments in relation to the abusive process and the political motivation of this prosecution more specifically. And that is I'll highlight two major developments. One is that, as you'll remember, Julian is prosecuted under two separate statutes. One is the Espionage Act, and that is really the center of gravity of this case. It's 17 counts, 170 years. And then there's 5 years under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and that's what I call the PR charge. That's what they use to sell. It's window dressing. It's what they use to sell this prosecution, especially to journalists, to say, oh, there's something to do with computers here. And they suggest there's some kind of hacking going on, and that way to attempt to put a wedge between Julian and the journalists and to basically obscure the fact of the 170 years and the weight of this prosecution, which is the Espionage Act. And when you look at that Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charge, is complete nonsense. The Manning court-martial, the Chelsea Manning court-martial, which happened in 2013, had all this evidence, could not establish any kind of computer, conspiracy. in the same chat logs that they had and which were out there for the past 9 years before this, or 8 years before this indictment came. Essentially, the charge in relation to Manning was such a shambles in the original hearings that the U.S. scrambled to try to prop it up with something. And so halfway through the extradition hearings back in 2020, they then issued a new indictment. It was their third indictment. And they said, hold on, this 5-year computer charge, we have something more. And it's still that same computer charge, but they said we have all this circumstantial new evidence that we want to put into the indictment. And that was just to prop it up because it was such an embarrassment when they tried to argue it in court. And the expert witness that we had, who had been a top computers forensic investigator of the U.S. military, tore it apart. So they introduced their new evidence, and their new evidence was a star witness, an Icelandic man who had, according to the indictment, said this and that about Julian and hackers and so on. So basically what's happened since then is that same star witness has come out to the press and retracted his testimony and said it's complete nonsense. That what the indictment says in relation to him is complete nonsense. So there's that. And so the courts in the UK haven't had an opportunity to consider that. But that goes to the abuse of process, that the indictment, the US indictment, has misled the UK courts, and that the US was perfectly aware of it. And then I'd say that the most, basically the new evidence that should put an end to this once and for all is the recent investigation by 3 investigative reporters, US reporters, into the CIA's role during the Trump administration in trying to basically take WikiLeaks out and take Julian out. When I say take Julian out, I mean in every sense. So what this revealed was a multi-pronged attack by the CIA under Mike Pompeo, which prioritized taking WikiLeaks out, taking a publisher out, through a comprehensive strategy, which involved planting disinformation in the media. It involved smearing Julian. It involved plans to abduct him from the embassy, plans to poison him in the embassy, plans to assassinate him. And that these plans were ordered by Mike Pompeo. He tasked his staff in the CIA to come up with specific sketches and options about how to do that, how to assassinate Julian. So this is really what it comes down to. This is what they were doing, and it's not like the CIA's plan was not carried out. CIA's plan was to ultimately to silence Julian and to imprison him, if not kill him. And that's what they've achieved for the past 3 years. It's been a completely successful CIA op, in at least insofar as silencing Julian. What they haven't managed to do, though, is to try to hide what's going on. In fact, yes, there were lots of attacks on his character, attacks planted in the media, false stories, most saliently the Paul Manafort story that was published on the front page of The Guardian, which was a complete fabrication. But there were many other stories that were also fabricated that had to be retracted, and all this is, unraveling, it was very clear from the beginning that this was a concerted strategy. But what they perhaps didn't count on is that all this would come to the surface. So it's come to the surface partly because of this extraordinary investigation in the U.S. by these 3 investigative reporters and their amazing sourcing. They had over 30 sources within the U.S. National Security Administration who confirmed this. But you have another element, which is in Spain, the security company, which was Spanish, was working for, the Spanish security company, which was working in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, ostensibly to provide security for Julian and the embassy, was actually a CIA contractor and was working for the CIA to spy on Julian and his lawyers, to steal their notebooks, to try to obtain the DNA of our 6-month-old baby, to follow people, not just inside the embassy. These are operations that also were carried out outside the embassy. And in Spain, the lawyers' offices were broken into, just extraordinary stuff. And this company is now under investigation. And we only know about this because whistleblowers within that security company came forward when Julian was arrested, because they realized what they had done, and their conscience drove them to reveal this and go to the police and tell them what they knew. So we have this extraordinary situation where, the CIA has not just, I won't confine it to the CIA, but when there's a political persecution, it is unprecedented that you get this kind of insight into the mechanics of persecution, of the coordination with the contractor, of the specific plans, the specific things that these people were tasked to do, to leave the door open in the embassy so Julian could be dragged out, and it would all be deniable, and that way he could be kidnapped. That the US and the UK authorities had talked about ramming a car if Julian was inside, and that's the possibility of shooting and assassination. So this is that is reality, It's not some fantasy novel or a Hollywood production. This is the reality. So in that context, Priti Patel's decision is just completely unbelievable. Completely unbelievable. I mean, it is a complete farce. But we should be thankful that we can see what a complete farce it is, because all of this information has been able to come to light. And now the courts will finally be confronted, the higher courts will be confronted with these very significant, legally significant points of law about press freedom, about the ability of governments to be able to bring political prosecutions against people, not just journalists, and whether the UK will protect people from political persecutions. The answer so far is no. Whether the UK's press protection laws operate in the same way Basically, the lack of protection for journalists operates in the same way as the US in relation to this case, which sets precedent. And all these things are being established, and this case will now create a binding legal precedent on the scope of press freedom in the UK. And ultimately, this will probably, if the UK courts do not find in favor of Julian on appeal, this will be taken to the European Court of Human Rights. And that will also shape the scope of press freedoms in the Council of Europe area. So this has enormous implications.
Stella made a pretty concise, she made a pretty concise wrap up of what's happened since that decision was delivered by Judge Assange. And I think it's very important to understand that the courts have not touched on anything to do with press freedom, to do with the CIA plot, to do with assurances. So now it's really good in the sense that they're going to be confronted with this. And it shows, I think, the weakness of the decision in 2021, where it was sort of bittersweet that, yeah, it's good, Assange is not extradited, but unfortunately it's only on health grounds. So the district judge is basically agreeing with all of this political stuff that, yeah, he's a spy, he's a hacker, horrific, basically criminalizing journalism in the United Kingdom. There's no question about it. And I've been seeing this case with my own eyes for 2 years now, and it's absolutely disgusting. It's something that you hear the UK criticize other countries about, but it's actually happening in central London. And one more thing that I'd like to add is also in terms of the assurances, because the United States gave these assurances 1 month after they lost the case. When the extradition hearing was taking place, they were saying that these special administrative measures are fine, right? It's like a summer camp. The prisoners have arts and crafts. They're making it out to be like something totally fine, when it's actually it's torture. And then after they lose the case, then they're saying, okay, we promise we won't put him in SAMS. He can go to Australia. The lawyer, the prosecutor for the United States, said that Assange can look forward to going to jail in Australia. I mean, this is the kind of language that they're using in court, right? It's completely draconian. And one of the cases cited by Assange's legal team was of a man named David Mendoza. He was extradited to the United States from Spain. Marie mentioned his case earlier, and it's very important because he not only got diplomatic assurances like Assange, he even got a contract, written signed contract, which are published. And you see the signature of David Mendoza, of the Spanish government, and the US government. On paper, so this is even better than what Assange was getting, and they still broke that, they still lied. When he got to the United States, they gave him 14 years, and they refused to send him back to Spain to serve a sentence like they promised. So really, like extremely clear abdication of their promises. Very clearly broke this contract, and it just kind of tells you what Assange can expect, right? Assange has, 10 years of persecution, a real target on his back. He's a victim of a political witch hunt. So I think that's also very important to keep in mind. And just disgusting what they were telling. These people are not stupid. If I know this, you know this, and we're seeing this in court, they know this. They are playing ball with the Americans. That's what's going on.
Well, Julian is in a single cell in Belmarsh prison, and he's confined inside his cell for, it depends on the day and the week and the COVID rate and so on. But, at least 20 hours a day, he's in a cell. And he's supposed to be able to go out every day for an hour, but that doesn't happen. It happens, generally he's able to go out once a day, when he's not having a meeting with a lawyer, or when he doesn't have a family visit, or if the prison is not short of staff, and so on. So it's not given. But is it better than in the embassy? No, it's worse, because his health has deteriorated over time. In the embassy, he had no outside space, no direct sunlight. Now he can go into the open air, but there's, it's still a concrete environment, and it's not enough. And the real fear for us is that Julian is entering a phase where he could have a catastrophic medical emergency. In October, he had a mini stroke. He's on medication now for stroke medication, but his health is deteriorating, and when you're in prison, it's hard to really imagine, if you haven't really had much to do with prisons, to really understand the difficulties you face in the most mundane aspects. First of all, like the main conditioning problem is that you have absolutely no control over your environment. The cell, they stick you in the cell, they lock the door. If you have, and everyone knows this who has a family member in prison, if they have some kind of medical emergency in the cell, it is really up to chance whether they ever make it out. You have to count on them being able to reach the alarm working, and someone responding to the alarm. And there are many prisoners who die in their cells because that night the prison didn't have enough staff, or they were, distracted with some other part, that's the reality. And that people die this way. So it's not just, the predictable concerns that we have over his deteriorating health, but something that could have a catastrophic outcome, something that might not can be treatable or preventable, becoming life-threatening or fatal. And Julian's been inside Belmarsh prison, which is the harshest prison in the UK, for over 3 years. And this is, it's not some high-tech prison. It's always extremely understaffed, and with lots of difficulties of underfunding and all these things. So it's a terrible and dangerous environment for him to be in. And of course, then we're also extremely worried about, well, worried isn't the word. An extradition to the US would be a death sentence. So even though it is very difficult for Julian in Belmarsh, in the US it would be 10 times worse. And we have no doubt that he will be placed in solitary confinement under extreme, being constantly watched. And even so, with all the psychological impact that carries, and then you have what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, Julian is not safe, and he will not survive extradition. And the doctors who have examined him have all reached that conclusion. The High Court accepted that evidence, that extradition would be so oppressive that it will drive him to commit suicide in conditions of isolation. And we're convinced that is what is going to happen. So we are, fighting for him to never be extradited. It cannot happen, because that's the end. That's the reality. extradition is a it's a shame on the UK. It is horrendous. It is a public shame. The OSCE human rights representative has written to Priti Patel saying, do not extradite Assange. This has enormous human rights implications. The Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Dunja Mijatovic, she has written to Priti Patel appealing to her not to extradite Julian. About 2,000 journalists, and by the way, all the journalists in the room, you can join this appeal. They're still getting signatures from journalists. They wrote to Priti Patel saying, do not extradite Assange because this case has implications for our safeguards, for our press freedoms. And, these are 2,000 journalists from around the world, all over the world. You can just imagine what governments in, I don't want to single anyone out because look what the US is doing, but all over the world are looking at this case and saying, well, if the US is doing this to Assange, the most high-profile publisher of the most extraordinary revelations about war crimes, state criminality, if they can do that to Assange, then of course we can do it to our, whoever the annoying dissident journalist, blogger, or whatever is in their country. So 2,000 journalists, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, 300 doctors also wrote to Priti Patel saying, do not sign off on this because you're relying on medical evidence that was taken 3 years ago. And look, look at what's happened since. He's had a mini stroke, and it is unethical, but also from a health perspective, completely impossible to extradite him. So this is just a big burden for the UK to continue forward. As I said, it's a political case, and it has to become extremely burdensome. It has to. Basically, the basic calculation is that extraditing Julian must be more of a burden than not extraditing him. And the only way you can change this balance is through public pressure. And it's happening. There's a lot of support being galvanized, but there has to be more. And now you have another element, which is the Australian government. There was recently a general election. There's a new prime minister. And that new prime minister, when he was in opposition, said about Julian's case, he said, enough is enough. It's time for Julian to come home. I do not understand what purpose is being served by keeping him in prison. Very, very strong statements. And he is now in power. And in Australia, there is enormous support for Julian. And, all the very kind of the heavy hitters are coming out and telling the Australian government that they need to step in. That is now the standard that is expected of the Australian government is that there has to be a political solution to be found. And then, there are there are political moves constantly. The Mexican government has said Julian is a political prisoner. The president, López Obrador, has said Julian is a political prisoner. This is a disgrace. Mexico will offer him political asylum. The French Mélenchon, who has legislative elections, the second round tomorrow, and who, there are good chances that he could be the next prime minister. He said, if I'm prime minister on Monday, I will make Julian Assange a French national and I will give him honors. Okay, this is incredibly important. These political signals to the UK, to the US, you stand alone. What you are doing is a travesty.
Yeah, so Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he's leading this leftist coalition called NUPES, and they're doing very well. They're a huge threat to Macron's coalition. They got literally the same results in the first round, and then in the next days they'll have the second round. It's not clear if he's going to be the prime minister, Mélenchon, but if he does end up being the prime minister, this is known as cohabitation. It's only happened a few times in France's history, at least in the Fifth Republic, and basically he could make life very, very uneasy for Macron. And as opposed to what we have in the UK with Boris Johnson, or other Western, I should say Anglo-European and Western leaders, Mélenchon has come out and said, Julian Assange has to be given citizenship. He should be naturalized. He should be received here. He should be decorated for his services to the French people. The Mexican president, as Barbara just pointed out, he has written a letter personally to the Americans and told them to drop this indictment against Assange. So you see the difference, right? At the end of the day, Assange is an Australian citizen. He's not even British. He's not American. In the movie, they were calling him a traitor on Fox News. A traitor to who? I don't know what that even means. But he's Australian, and his own government have abandoned him. Stella just talked about how Albanese, when he was in the opposition, he advocated on Assange's behalf. Now he's the prime minister, and he's suddenly quiet. And the statement that was released yesterday by the Australian Foreign Ministry regarding Priti Patel's decision, it's scandalous, right? They don't say we condemn this decision or we are enraged. They say we note. We note. I don't know it's the most ridiculous verb you could possibly use. That's his government. That's his own government. So even when they say things like, Assange can go serve his sentence in Australia, he shouldn't serve his sentence in a McDonald's or an embassy. Why should he be in prison anywhere, Australia or otherwise? And another thing that people overlook is that for that to happen, Australia has to say yes. You cannot just ship prisoners wherever you like. Australia has to say yes. They have said absolutely nothing. Given their language, you can see why. This is a Five Eyes country at the end of the day. They have a huge American spy base in Australia at Pine Gap. Australia, as I said, is one of the Five Eyes country with the UK, New Zealand, Canada, US. So they are really just an extension of the Americans. People call Australia an unsinkable American aircraft carrier because it's really what it is. And another aspect is that even if they did say yes, you can only, under the prisoner transfer treaty, the Strasbourg Treaty, you can only transfer a prisoner once they've finalized their sentence. That means you've gone through all appeal courts. So if Assange gets to the US and they try him and they say you must go to prison for X years, he's obviously going to appeal that, right? He's going to go and try to go to the Supreme Court. And this takes 10 years maybe. So even then, this guy is going to be 60, 70 years by the time he gets to Australia. So, even if they get him on one count of espionage, that's 10 years. And then in the United States, they have the sentencing guidelines. So the 10 years can turn into 20 years maybe, right? Because they say, oh, you're the head of the organization. They treat you like the mafia, right? They treat you like they're prosecuting someone from organized crime. Like, oh, you're not just a member, you're the head of WikiLeaks. And you said this and this at this conference, and you solicited information, and blah, blah, blah. And then the 10 years becomes who knows how many years. So, he just turned, he's going to be 51 in a few days, Assange. And, 1, 2, 3 counts, he's looking at a life sentence. And of course, in the worst prison in the United States. So no matter how you look at this case, it's so egregious. Like, Stella just mentioned a moment ago that you have 300 doctors that have written a letter on Assange's behalf. 300 doctors. How many prisoners get 300 doctors to write a letter on their behalf? Never mind the lawyers that have written on Assange's behalf. Never mind the people that testified on Assange's behalf. People like Noam Chomsky. People that have come out in support for him. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And the fact that this is, continuing in broad daylight, I really don't know what to say. look at this legally, morally, ethically, it just doesn't add up. It's impermissible, it's egregious, and it's scandalous. I think that's really the word to describe it. It's absolutely scandalous. And Stella also touched on a very important fact, is that the medical information is outdated, right? So they're saying that they think Assange is fit enough to be sent to the United States. They didn't take into account that he had a mini stroke in October, right? They don't take into account the fact that, well, again, this is during the appeals process now is finally going to be touched on, which is that he's a journalist. He's not, a serial rapist or some mass murderer. They're treating him like one, like a war criminal. He's not, and the CIA has tried to take his life, or at least considered taking his life. All of these aspects have to be taken into consideration, and they just haven't been as of yet. But even I think before getting there, it's clear that this should never have gotten this far at all. And the movie that we just watched, I think, really perfectly encapsulated how determined and driven they are to get this guy. They will do absolutely anything, which shows you that it's political. That's what it is.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, Stella, you're back.
When you look at extraditions, actually governments tend to, traditionally, tend to have the final word. Precisely because even if the extradition legally is sound, there may be a political element that the government has some reason to weigh into. As you'll remember, the UK government barred the extradition of Augusto Pinochet to Spain. The UK government has a separate power to the courts. So the courts consider some aspects, some grounds, and then the Home Secretary considers some other grounds. Now, over time, the Home Secretary's grounds for refusing an extradition have become smaller and smaller. And the reason for that goes to the recent history of the UK. There have been some very high-profile extradition cases, notably that of Gary McKinnon, who was wanted under hacking charges in the United States because he allegedly hacked into some into a government database trying to find evidence of extraterrestrial life. He's on the autism spectrum, and they wanted to put him away for life. And this case, this extradition was stopped by the UK government. And as a result of that decision by the Home Secretary at the time, who was Theresa May, the UK received a huge backlash from their US allies. There's a book about how about the current leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, who at the time was the head of the prosecution service here, traveled to Washington to apologize for what his government had done, because he had promised the US that he would deliver Gary McKinnon, but there was a political intervention. And the government doesn't like it, because when they have the power to stop an extradition, they get enormous political pressure from the public. And that's what happened with Priti Patel. She had huge pressure to stop the extradition. And so what happened between Gary McKinnon and Julian's case is that the Parliament restricted the powers of the government and said, no, there are even less grounds under which they can consider blocking an extradition. Even so, Priti Patel had very good reasons and very well-founded reasons, even under those restricted arguments, which are more political, then that she could have stopped this extradition, and she should have stopped this extradition, but she didn't. And of course, the way they've angled it in their press release is, oh well, the courts have already looked at this, and they didn't find any reason for us to stop it, so the Home Secretary is allowing it. That's not at all how it's structured. The Home Secretary has completely separate arguments that she has to look at. She's not reviewing the court's decision. She's looking at a separate set of arguments. And that's why at this stage, when we appeal to the High Court, which is the next step that's coming, we're appealing both in relation to the US government, which are the arguments that the courts have already looked at, and in relation to the grounds that were presented to the Home Secretary. These are two separate areas. And the Home Secretary was pretending to say, oh, my role was just to rubber stamp this, the court's already looked at it and it's fine. That's what the press release says, basically, and it's completely misleading. She had the discretion, she should have blocked it, and now her decision will be challenged before the courts.
I'll just say that, or reiterate what Stella said before, is that going to the European Court of Human Rights, that is one avenue that Assange has. And yeah, I mean, the problem with that, though, one of the fears is that right now there's a new initiative under the British government to deport asylum seekers and refugees to Rwanda. So the current government is threatening to withdraw from the Council of Europe, from the European Court of Human Rights over this, and that would be very fatal and very bad for Julian Assange, because as we know, these court proceedings take months, they take literally years for just a few steps, and by the time he ends up or chooses to go to the European Court of Human Rights, who knows what the UK government has done? They might have gutted the Human Rights Act already and just left the European Court of Human Rights, and then this whole avenue is completely blocked off. So this is, I guess it's par for the course for this kind of administration to do that, but it's a very big problem, a very big risk, and yeah, it's important. I think what you were hinting at, that there's some kind of, that this is also finalized in a more universal jurisdiction. But even in the film, we saw that the United Nations came out and made a ruling, and they just disregard it. They just think that it's a joke, and that's the problem when you have governments like this. They're really authoritarian at the end of the day. They do whatever they want, and they don't care about the EU, they don't care about the UN, or anybody who's, or their own people. They're their own people.
So there is a delay for the appeal, 2 weeks, no?
Yeah, so
14 days.
right.
14 days.
2 weeks.
Yeah, 14 days. Yeah.
14 days, which is very short.
It really depends on if Julian wins this, when we win this, the grounds the courts find for refusing the extradition. Because, we're fighting this extradition, but we're also fighting an enormous layer of obfuscation, of disinformation, and that was precisely what the purpose was, to reduce support for him, to make it very difficult for him to fight a political case by trying to reduce political support and attack his reputation and make all these personal attacks. So at least we've been able to air in court sworn testimony from, for example, journalists who worked alongside Julian during the Manning leaks, saying that he was extremely cautious with protecting people, that he redacted, that he was the one that was driving the whole redaction process, that he took every step to try to prevent the Guardian's debacle, which resulted in the cables being published by third parties on the internet, and so on. All this story that has been completely buried, and the Pentagon talking points that were being pushed out at the very first press conference back in 2010 still come up. I still have to counter these talking points with long since established facts that have been, established in court proceedings and so on. So it's an enormous endeavor to try to undo the damage that has been done in misinforming the public debate around this case. But it is happening. As I said, the CIA investigation, incredible. That is, I find it's a blessing, that there are journalists that actually have been digging and wanted to get to the bottom of this, and to their credit, it couldn't have been very easy. The whistleblowers in Spain, Nils Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, up until a couple of months ago, wrote a very good book which deconstructs the process through which the US shifted attention from evidence of concrete war crimes and killings of civilians in their tens of thousands to Julian, and to turn him into a figure that people should attack for whatever reason. I think it goes to some very dark part of human, I don't want to say human instinct, but it must be, to kind of pile on pile on against a person who's vulnerable, and they exploited it to the fullest. And of course, the CIA has been developing propaganda techniques for decades and decades, and they've deployed them against many targets. And Julian is a prime target. And this is what I tend to say when I get this question, but this and that about his character and so on. But first of all, it's completely untrue. He is a wonderful, brilliant, loving, caring human being, funny, and absolutely wonderful. So you're wrong. But think about this. Julian's character is a narrative battleground. It is of the highest importance to the CIA, and I'm not just talking about the CIA, it's just to say, to the people that Julian exposed, to the powers who are threatened by what WikiLeaks does, who understand the enormous weight that Julian's opinion and analysis has, because because WikiLeaks is synonymous with reliable information. In this day and age, how valuable is that? And that is why Julian is the prime target. He has to be, his standing has to be weakened. And how do they do that? They do that through attacks to his character. So I say, well, at least acknowledge that Julian's character is the site of a narrative battleground. And given that, and given the power of his enemies, at least give him the benefit of the doubt. Look at the evidence of all the good he's done, what he's constructed, what he's said, because, there's been an enormous effort to silence Julian. I encourage people to look at his conferences and YouTube videos where he's speaking, and then you see the real Julian. And and then you have what people say about him. And, you know, they have a lot of amplification and a lot of power behind that amplification, a lot of corporations, a lot of interests, and so on. But then you have the reality, and look at the reality, and at the very least, acknowledge that Julian's person is a narrative battleground. So, sorry, down to the question. There has to be a deconstruction of all the harm there has been in order to keep him safe. You know, there's a direct correlation. It's difficult to give a short answer, and I'm not a terribly detailed expert on the National Security Bill. I have read a few articles, and essentially it looks like what Priti Patel wants to do is to make it easier to prosecute journalists, to make it easier to also go after foreign journalists or journalists working for foreign organizations or funded by a foreign organization. The Official Secrets Act is already, under. It's a terrible statute, and what Priti Patel is trying to do is trying to make it even worse. And I mean, what that is in keeping with extraditing Julian. There is an agenda here to be able to exercise the coercive use of legislation in order to silence the press, and all the implications that has. So it's been described as a power grab, and I think that's exactly what it is.
Thank you very much, Stella Assange. Thank you very much, Richard Matters. I thank all of you in the audience for your comments, for contributions, and for joining us here. Thank you so much,
Hello, Assange. Hello.